Hello, Rocco. Thank you for joining us. Um, Guys, first of all, I've been watching the conference. Terrific so far. We're very excited. With us today from Marsh is Rocco Mancini. Hi, Rocco. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Rayne. So I share a little bit about myself. I'm part of Marsh's Captive Solutions Group, and I'm kind of in an interesting area where not only do I work closely kind of with the brokerage side where we work with traditional insurers, but my role is day in and day out also working with companies that want to form their own insurance companies. So I kind of get the unique view of the insurance world and also get to see how digital assets play in both in the traditional brokerage model, the traditional insurer model, and even in sort of the startup insurer model.
That's awesome. We're gonna make some assumptions about people's knowledge of insurance here and digital assets. But can you just give us a little bit about captives, and then kind of how Marsh is looking at this world and how you guys are approaching digital assets and how you think about them as far as your growth and Marsh goes.
Sure. So what I'll do is I'll start with the greater overall Marsh part and then get into captives. Where Marsh really you could see our significant foray into the world of digital assets with the formation of our digital asset risk transfer group, which is where after working with companies in the digital asset space, I want to say it was probably 4 or 5 years ago, we recognized the need that we needed to have dedicated resources to tackle the unique challenges that that the digital asset companies were facing with regards to procuring insurance, right? And that's essentially at the point Marsh realized that there are unique risks here. We're going to need to have a team of people who understand these risks and can work with the insurance industries to help educate insurers and to work with the digital asset companies to help find ways to procure them insurance, which oftentimes in the business world could be a very necessary requirement, either from just purely a reputational perspective or a contractual or regulatory perspective. So that's sort of where Marsh's foray into the digital asset world started. And specifically where I am, though, I'm in captive insurance, where rather than working with companies to ensure they have insurance policies, my role is more I work with companies to help them determine if it's feasible for them to have their own wholly owned insurance company. And they may have that for a whole host of reasons, whether it's simply self-insuring their own risks, or also in some cases using it as a means to start up insurance companies that in the future will resemble more traditional insurers or reinsurance companies.
That's really fascinating. And just to contextualize that for people, so um, generally in insurance cases where there are specific or hard to price risks, you'll often see companies make the choice to self insure by forming a captive, usually for US based companies, a Cayman or Bermuda, but a Caribbean domicile, where then they can more accurately price their risks and get better pricing and a better match of their liabilities. Is that a good way of summarizing the captive experience?
Yes, and even more interestingly, before you get to the point where you feel like you can price it accurately, I think the most interesting part about that is that forming a regulated vehicle and starting to move into a regulated ecosystem means that you're formally collecting data now. And that's
Mm.
the key component, the first step into getting to the point where we can have more pricing, right? It's the same with traditional insurance as well, as beginning the process where, and working within these formal regulations, we're creating formal processes that are very important for data collection. And we've worked with companies where part of it just was, especially tech companies with new and emerging risks, it was, they knew they were going to struggle to purchase insurance. One of the means that they wanted to do to approach the traditional insurance market in the future was to start self-insuring the risks, gathering the data on their own, and being able to have evidence for the insurance industry that, hey, this is an insurable risk. We have the data, we work through the pricing, we found numbers that work. Let us share our information with you. And what we'll do, and hopefully what we'll be able to do, is come to an agreement of, some amount of risk transfer in the very near future.
Got it. So that first cohort is digital asset companies that fall into early stage technology companies who are looking for that. And then the most important factor there is really the collection of data so you can more accurately price this. But as interesting and as sizable as that market is, because we're talking about, I'm guessing, digital asset exchanges, digital asset custody companies, companies that have large digital asset exposures and need to insure them. But I'm guessing that Marsh sees greater potential than just the immediate digital asset ecosystem. Is that fair?
Yes, that's very fair to say.
When we think about that, and I know it's early going here, and part of I'm from working with you guys and understanding your approach to not overstating things. What is Marsh's outlook for that kind of that digital asset area specifically, and kind of the broader application of this technology for insurance going forward, like 2022 and beyond?
Yeah, so one of the things that we always talk about in Marsh is one of the most important upcoming pieces for the digital asset industry and digital assets and insurance is that we're seeing more and more potential for regulatory certainty and the development of ecosystems around that. And one of the most interesting things, and why I'm excited to be part of this discussion right now, is that you have players like Arca who are working on creating digital assets that fall into a more regulated ecosystem. And why that's very interesting is that what we're able to see is that it creates a path where you're working directly with regulators, you're sharing that information. And once those paths start to develop and you're able to do that, what we're able to see is that you have an increased comfort level from all parties involved. Once they start to see something and can feel something that's more, that's more akin to what they're traditionally comfortable with, right? It's a little bit different, but it's a great way to start off that educational process to get them really involved and to understand it. And the most important part about that is that as we see, as we see that more regulatory certainty come out of it, as we see a more willingness to share information with regulators, we'll see more brokers and insurance companies, the digital asset industry, and folks in the digital asset industry able to come together to start further building out this ecosystem. We're going to see more. You'll see more of a willingness to participate in pilots, to try new things, to build new products jointly, and to collaborate in that, to share information together. And that's something I see that's very, very key to the process. And we're seeing more of that, as we mentioned, with Arca's doing in 2022 and beyond, what other folks are doing to really create this ecosystem that's working with the regulatory environment today, that's working to try to achieve that regulatory certainty, so that we could. Sorry, go ahead.
No, please finish your thought, please.
And just say, so we could go to see that we'll start to move from where we're building things today to slowly move to a paradigm shift where we see digital assets more actively involved in the insurance industry and many financial sectors as a whole.
What I was going to say was, I think it's really fascinating when you think about insurance. First of all, when you think about financial services, obviously incredibly heavily regulated, and then you think of insurance, which is even further regulated, I would say, because the idea of regulations having reserves enough to meet policy contingents, and there's a whole different level of regulation. How would you classify the regulatory response and either excitement, trepidation from the insurance regulation world to digital assets? Where are they in kind of like the adoption and how they're thinking about it? Are they positive, negative, lukewarm? How would you classify what's going on there?
So I've been fortunate enough to personally have conversations with regulators, and I've worked with some of the regulatory departments in areas where we see major captive domiciles, but also working more broadly and trying to get these ideas up to the insurance commissioner level and things like that. And what we're finding was that we found that they were very receptive to the ideas. We weren't running into issues where we'd simply go to regulators and we'd have a hard stop and immediately start a conversation. And what that led to, and I thought was the most interesting, was that openness often led to follow up with educational discussions. And even when we weren't all on the same level, there was the regulators were willing to dedicate time to sit with us to better understand what digital assets are, and to think about, well, if we were to use digital assets in the context of insurance, whether it's to capitalize insurance companies, to transact in them, to writing limits in digital assets. We received openness from many regulators with these concepts and these ideas. And that's not to say that we can get everything accomplished on day one, but they were willing to work with us and to think creatively. And then even to start thinking about the benefits that the underlying technologies of digital assets could bring, such as using blockchain. I've had conversations with regulators that, what if we were to make it easier for you to audit the information that we were doing with these digital assets by allowing you to have a spectator node on the blockchain so you can view the transactions? Would this make this more comfortable for you? Can we actually start re-envisioning the underlying processes? And all of a sudden, when we start having conversations about, instead of just can we use digital assets, it's rethinking the entire underlying processes that we're using in the insurance industry, even at the regulatory level. And that's what's the most exciting thing about this technology, in my opinion, is that it's starting to get, everyone involved, once you really start to get into the weeds, to start to rethink, older processes that can really benefit from advances in technology, whether it's blockchain or any other form of digital assets.
Wow, I think that is incredibly exciting because it's one level, like I said, and when we talk about these kind of first order implementations of things, it's a very straight line thing from your business and insurance business in general, insure digital assets and how we do that and looking at as a novel thing that has hard to insure risk. But then when you're talking about the actual implementation of blockchain to enhance both the customer experience, both the regulator experience, and actually change the nature of insurance, the fact that you're telling me that discussions have progressed to the point where you're discussing with regulatory bodies actually running their own spectator node and them understanding that and actually contemplating the benefit of that, that's remarkable. Did I understand you correctly in that you're saying that those type of conversations have occurred and they're actually contemplating this?
Yes, and we saw interest there. And I think the most important part to recognize, though, and just not to taper the excitement, but I think it's important to see these are the small critical steps we're taking along the way, right? Our view at Marsh is that we're working to take these small steps because eventually that's going to create the ecosystem we need to do these bigger and better and more amazing things. So where today we're having those conversations with regulators, we hope that these will continue to progress until we get to the point in the future where we're able to implement these. Now, as you know, the insurance industry has many parties involved to all these transactions. There's many stakeholders involved. So it is a long and slow process. But with any major technological change and whenever there's a potential for a paradigm shift, we see that, right? You take the small steps. There's so much that seems to be happening behind the scenes that sometimes we're not even aware of. But those slow, small pieces of change, and I apologize for my dog in the background.
That's okay. While you're waiting for your dog, but I will take your contextualization of the small steps, and believe from working with us that we are very much in the intermittent iterative steps, but I refuse to dampen or temper my excitement over this progress because what you're talking about is really revolutionary stuff. And we know that areas like regulated funds, insurance areas that are heavily regulated, these changes cannot occur fast. And it doesn't even matter if the value proposition and what the technology is suggesting is so transformative or whatever. If it's going to be implemented slowly in the best absolute case scenario, and worst case scenario, nothing happens, which is often a lot of case because it's like you say, there's many ecosystem players, there's many stakeholders, there's jurisdictional considerations. It's very hard to get everybody on the same page for these things. But I would say I was surprised to hear that statement. That is an embracing, even as an idea, the idea of using blockchain as it's intended for its observational purposes and gaining things like that. Action, even small action, starts with the idea and considering it. So I refuse to temper my excitement over that. When you think about these iterative steps and where it could go, Rocco, and I'm not asking for time or this is some sort of promissory thing of that this is where the space will be. We know it'll develop at its own pace and the appropriate speed. But what do you see as far as blockchain technology and how it would impact insurance, and how is Marsh kind of seeing this at its fullest expression?
Sure. And I think that, you know, it's such a good question where to start, right? There's a lot we could be forward looking, and I think I'm going to be a little bit broad here, right? And I'm going to go back to my earlier statement in that when we think of the insurance industry, there's a lot of underlying processes that simply, they've been around for a long time, right? It's a very old industry. And I think what we're going to see is that there's going to be an interest in really looking at those processes and changing some of them and doing some of that differently. One of the things, for example, one of the things we're seeing right now is an interest in using smart contracts on the blockchain to simplify reinsurance transactions, right? Mm-hmm. To make it so those are easier to audit and, it's easier to share that data. So broadly, one of the things I think we're going to see a lot of is where it's going to become simpler to share the data with all parties involved, whether it's between insureds and brokers or insureds and insurance companies with insureds and regulators, brokers and regulators, whoever it may be. We're going to see where it's going to become simpler to be able to share that information. And I think, and it doesn't sound exciting, but when you think about it, the challenge with where you have a highly regulated industry where there's many processes involved and it's often slow to move. When you're thinking about those underlying processes, the most critical processes of the insurance industry, where you're sharing that information, where you're with the contractual agreements with all the parties involved, when you're thinking about how you can fundamentally change those, the impact could be very significant. And we already see where where you have, I like to give the example of where you see like the Nexus Mutuals of the world, where they're kind of piloting that concept, right? How can we take these technologies, do a showcase of what it can be done, how we can take the current processes and speed them up. And the most interesting thing about that is, there's so much costs and time and administrative work that's built into it, right? And what we see is that when you're fundamentally able to reduce operating costs, when you're fundamentally able to make these processes faster, all of a sudden you wind up in a position where there was insurance products that weren't feasible that may be feasible now. You may be able to move the needle enough that you're able to do more creative things. We're able to see more unique insurance products and things like that. So with digital assets and blockchain coming more to the insurance industry, these are the kinds of things we hope to see. What will it ultimately look like is very difficult. It's almost like looking and saying, looking at a singularity and saying, at what point, what is it going to look like past this point, right? And it's all speculation. And I don't think, there's any official position we could take at Marsh exactly what it's going to look like. But, all we know is that we are seeing interest in the technology. There's significant potential based on the underlying areas it's targeting, because those are some of the most critical areas in the insurance industry, where if you were to improve them and to create efficiencies, that you would see meaningful changes in development. And I think that's what's very interesting about this.
I couldn't agree more. And I think we agree as well on this when we're talking about, like you say, I think that metaphor of a singularity, like, those things are things like big bangs, points of information where tremendous change and energy is going on, but incredibly hard to predict outcomes, because literally the rules of relativity and the laws that are going to govern this are being created right now. And you have this limited and very small observational piece. It's going to be big and changing. And I think that people have to recognize that it's very hard to predict these outcomes, but you would be, in my estimation, foolish not to at least recognize that there's very large change coming, and you should probably start to build in some way to observe it, to be flexible, to start learning about some of the laws that will be governing this new universe and how they might impact your business. I think for our audience, what would also be interesting is, if they're not familiar with Nexus Mutual, to just give an idea of what they're doing as a truly native blockchain insurance application. Just a tiny little bit of explanation for that for context.
Sure. So, the basics of Nexus Mutual is that they use a mutual model that I believe was developed in London, if I recall correctly, where it's not truly traditional insurance in that the mutual works and that the members of the mutual have the rights to approve or deny the claims. But what Nexus Mutual has done is they've used smart contracts and they've used their platform in order to help automate that process and to help decentralize it, where you have all these individual members that are able to participate in this without necessarily needing to have one single central owner of this platform. And what's very interesting is that they have been able to pay claims. They have been able to function as it was intended. So it's a very interesting use case in that, when you think about it, you have all these completely unrelated individuals around the world that are able to participate this, and it's still able to function efficiently and do what it set out to accomplish, which just kind of shows that, if you were to take that same kind of process where you had completely random people around the world with no other connection other than just the bare minimum, trying to do that with traditional insurance, it suddenly becomes much more difficult. You need more people involved to help coordinate things. Well, It's just interesting to see where that's with the use of smart contracts, how you're kind of able to help coordinate that and bring everyone together with the technology.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And that idea of basically creating a decentralized mutual insurance company organized on the blockchain where you, like you say, very little or almost no really centralized coordination through the mechanics of smart contracts. And now what they're able to insure and how they do it is very rudimentary in terms of, the sophistication of where insurance has become now. But you can see it as the proto concept of what fully mechanical decentralized insurance may become. And you also see how fast something like that, and this is where we see this is something that's almost universal to blockchain projects and things like that. The organization and formation of capital, while the Nexus Mutual concept is very basic and it's ensuring like fairly binary things, because this is like an early technology and kind of like a V1 of these things, but they were able to gather a significant amount of capital, and like you say, paying claims and operating at a way that it would hard to be imagined to like bring something that big together that quickly, and is an interesting example of how like the combinations of stakeholder alignment, capital formation of blockchain, married with something that's considered as traditionally like oriented as insurance, how that can be energized. And we all know insurance. It's hardly seen generally as the hotbed of innovation and technological forwardness. But in digital assets, it actually really is. Some of the most interesting things going on when you talk about real capital, large allocation of money, regulators actually working with digital assets. Insurance is really kind of on the forefront of digital assets as far as financial services. Would you say that that's accurate?
I would say that it is, and I think that it's interesting how digital assets and what the value they could bring aligns so closely with insurance. And you see a lot of applications with decentralized finance and things like that. But I always found where it was the most interesting from the insurance perspective, because like I said, we know there's so many underlying processes, even more so than many other traditional financial sectors. And we know that there's a lot that can be automated. There's a lot of underlying processes that we could rethink. There's a lot of rigid regulations involved, and there's, as you know, especially in the U.S., where the regulations varying by state, there's many stakeholders involved, and and that's where I like to focus on that ability, that sharing of information. That sometimes it seems so easy to forget with digital assets, how easy it is to share that information, to create clear audit trails, to have that level of transparency that really was necessary in the insurance industry. And because the insurance industry benefits so much from those developments, especially, that's where I could see where the insurance industry is in many ways is at the forefront of thinking about digital assets, especially in the sense of within a regulatory ecosystem that. In other words, in a system where we're really trying to work with regulators, we're trying to work with the traditional systems and create a paradigm shift, and really trying to slowly, to go back to the singularity, kind of slowly steer the boat that's constantly heading towards the singularity, whether we like it or not, right? We don't know what the future looks like, but the point of having these discussions, the point of working with regulators, the point of working with traditional insurers and traditional brokers and doing these things is because we're trying to steer this boat as much as possible, because we know the change is coming. We know that regulations will, change with regards to digital assets in the future. And the importance of being involved in this and trying to create that ecosystem is to really help steer the boat in a direction where, we're truly able to utilize the technology to its fullest.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm tremendously excited too. I didn't even realize that we're actually over our official time, but I've been told we have a few more minutes. If you had a closing thought to the couple things, one or two. If anybody here is interested in insurance applications, either they're people with digital assets exposure, interested in how the technology might be implemented in their business, and I don't mean now. I mean to start, as we know, these are investigations that are very specific that have to start, with a talk, and move on from there. If you accept the singularity approach, what would you say to people that are on at this conference of how they would go about investigating insurance in their business and how it might be applicable to them? Is it appropriate to reach out to you guys, or what would be a good place to start?
Yes, they can always reach out to us. We'll always be glad to help. I'll always be glad to answer questions. Even more simply, if they don't feel comfortable reaching out to us yet, I'll always say to take the approach that I kind of did, that kind of got me into meeting, digital assets to what I did in and day out on captive insurance, which wasn't inherently something that dealt with digital assets, but I kind of took the areas that I was familiar with. So if you're familiar with digital assets, think about that, and then think about ways that could apply to insurance, or where you're interested in insurance. Sometimes it's as simple as a Google search, right? But start asking the questions, kind of being inquisitive. That's kind of, what I find is that's often the best approach, because eventually you kind of hit a wall where you realize, I've hit my limit of expertise. I know what I can contribute to this. Now I'd like to go out and take a collaborative approach, find people to work with, or, in a lot of cases where I'm here today, it's having an opportunity to have people to come to me after I've kind of explored, worked with it, kind of asked these questions, participated in the process. But I'm always glad if anyone would want to reach out to me to ask those questions, to start thinking about things, start brainstorming, especially, like I said, I'm in the captive insurance world. We're looking at where we're actually forming wholly owned insurance companies and really building insurance companies from the ground up. So I do have an interesting line of sight into that, but I'm always glad to answer any of those questions. But I always will be glad to encourage anyone as well to just thinking about, whether, even if it's not, inherently knowledge about the digital asset industry, thinking about where your skills of expertise are, thinking about where you can contribute to help steering this boat, and what you can do, because then that's where I feel like you find your passion in this process. You get to be really creative, and that's how conversations like these really start to manifest.
Rocco, I couldn't agree more. And thank you. I can tell from interacting with you guys, just in the way you creatively approach this, education first, collaborative, not overpromissory, and, that patient approach and constantly, tempering excitement and marrying it with reality, is, I think, a view that is going to be very constructive going forward in this space and move us all forward. So really thanks for your efforts. Thanks for Marsh's efforts, and thanks for joining us today here. I love this talk.
Of course, and thanks for having me, Rayne. I really appreciate it.